All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening or morning for Miles for the Southeast Asia program's final GADI lecture of the fall series. We've had a really wonderful semester of speakers and talks and are really looking forward to our spring lineup. So thank you for joining us for our last talk. And as our talk this evening discusses the current political struggle in Myanmar, we're going to be posting in the chat two sites of resources, one to learn more about the coup's impact and a link to where you can directly donate to those participating in the civil disobedience movement. So I'll be posting those in the chat in a moment, and we really encourage folks to check those links out. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to a PhD student in Science and Technology Studies, who will be introducing our speaker tonight.
Hi, everyone. Like Tamar said, thank you for coming tonight. And it's quite late for a lot of us who are on the East Coast. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Miles Kenny Lazar, who will be speaking to us bright and early, all the way from Singapore. Professor Kenny Lazar is an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore. His research addresses the changing political ecologies of land and property in the Mekong region, especially how the capitalization and commodification of land produces unequal agrarian and environmental geographies with significant ramifications to livelihoods and the resistance to these processes by the rural poor. His research examines land contestation related to the expansion of Chinese, Vietnamese, and Burmese agro-industrial plantations and special economic zones in Laos and Myanmar. Professor Kenny Lazar has published a number of articles and book chapters on these topics, and the latest one was published this year, and it's titled The Spatial Politics of Land Policy Reform in Myanmar and Laos. So I would really recommend that people check that out. Please help me in welcoming our speaker.
Great, thank you very much for the kind introduction, A. And let me just share my screen here. All right, do you see the presenter view or the full screen?
Right now, we are seeing your presenter view.
Okay, let me just switch that then. Is that better?
Oh, I mean the correct view. We're seeing, I think, what you want us to be seeing right now.
Right now? Okay, great. So thank you very much to the GADI lecture series and the Southeast Asia program at Cornell for this invitation, especially the graduate students. And I'd particularly like to thank the graduate student co-chairs, Tamar Law and Harry Deans, for organizing the talk, and Ava White for administrative support, and Eamon Tant for kindly introducing me. So just a little bit more background about myself. So I've been working on the political ecologies of land and plantations in Laos for the past decade and a half. And then I more recently started working on similar issues in Myanmar 5 years ago, just a few years before the pandemic and then later the coup. And that was focused on conflicts over oil palm plantations in Tanantai region in the south. So my research was cut short by the pandemic and then more seriously by the coup. And I wasn't actually quite sure how to continue working on land issues afterwards until I was contacted by some researchers with the Burmese American Community Institute, particularly their Center for Research Policy and Innovation. Since the coup, they've become more interested in working on issues related to Myanmar and not just around the diaspora. And I want to recognize that this research was conducted with incredible support of two research collaborators who go by the pseudonyms of Monster and Kate, as they are both associated with the civil disobedience movement, or CDM, and thus need to protect their identity. And assure you, despite the name, Monster is a lovely person and a wonderful researcher, and they've both been incredibly important for this project. So in terms of motivations, this project and their interest is really driven by an attempt to understand how land issues are being approached by a range of actors that had previously been involved in land reform. So before the coup of February 1st, 2021, there was a lot of interest in land issues in Myanmar, a lot of politics and struggles over land, and also a lot of reform to land governance. So the coup, of course, has radically changed many different things in the country, and people are dealing with much more urgent problems such as human rights abuses, conflict, setting up alternative governance systems, and humanitarian issues. But in the more than 1.5 years since the coup, there's increasingly interest in addressing a range of different governance issues, and that includes land. And so there's kind of a movement towards addressing a range of issues such as healthcare, education, and environment as well. But it can be difficult to address these topics in an open way, partly due to security concerns, but also a dispersion of actors across many different places, hiding in different places within Myanmar, or in exile, or otherwise. And so there's a need to kind of meet in secret or meet online. There's a lot of kind of care taken to protecting identities and anonymity. And so it can be difficult to have these kinds of open discussions about issues like land and how to address them and how to work on these and try to address land issues in the future. And so this project was really about using research to interact with a range of different actors who are generally resisting the military junta and seeking to institute changes to lead towards a federal democratic society, to try to kind of use the research to generate that dialogue and discussion about how to address the long-standing land issues that have plagued the country in the current moment, but also how to think about that in the future. So the project really asks 3 main questions about what is to be done with land in this current context, in a context of conflict and revolution, but one in which people are thinking about what kind of new society they would like to see. So we asked what kinds of political transitions would resistance actors like to see, how land should be governed in a kind of an ideal future that is federal and democratic, and then how can these changes be pursued in the short and long term. So we have kind of a few different arguments. I mean, I should first say there's a huge amount of diversity and perspectives on this issue, as you might imagine, as there's a huge diversity of different types of actors who have worked on land in the past and continue to be interested in land today. But there's a kind of few key points that have come out of our work. The first being that land continues to be an incredibly important issue, even during a period of conflict, that it's something that many people are still heavily concerned about issues of land grabbing that continue to this day, issues of territorial control, but also that people, despite all of the kind of challenges that they're facing today, are still interested in thinking about the future, because that's a future that they're fighting for. And so I think reflecting on the desires and aspirations for future changes in land governance doesn't necessarily detract from the myriad struggles that are going on right now. And actually land issues are quite connected to many of those. So the other thing that we've found is that the coup has really kind of had a radicalizing effect upon many people many were already critical of land issues before, but there was a general sense that during the liberal transition period, the democratic transition, that there was hope for an attempt to kind of work with the system to make positive change and move forward and progress. But I think since the coup, there's been a kind of transition in perspective that many people want to really transform and revolutionize the system and do away with the old land governance system. And then some kind of key principles, which maybe seem somewhat obvious, but I think are important, is that the future of land for many of the people we talk to has to be democratic in the hands of people. It has to be federal, meaning that it has to be decentralized based upon the diverse ways of managing and owning land, especially customary land across the country. So in terms of, I think it's worth saying a little bit about methods, because we had to use some unique methods that I guess have become a little bit more normalized during the pandemic, and also are very, familiar for people working in Myanmar, is that all this research was done online, as it's the easiest way to communicate with a large number of people dispersed across different locations who want to be careful about their identity and information that they're sharing. And that also meant that we used encrypted means of communication as much as possible. And we're very careful about how information was shared about identities, even within our team, making sure that we're very careful about how we store data so that it's always in kind of locked and encrypted databases. So we ended up conducting 27 semi-structured interviews, and with a range of different actors. So pretty pleased with the diversity of people we talked to across the Government in Exile National Unity Government, or NUG, with ethnic resistance organizations, or sometimes called ethnic armed organizations, EROs or EAOs, with civil society groups, international NGOs, and also some of the local administrative bodies that are associated, connected to the NUG, and then a range of different other key informants. So as you might imagine, though, this approach has some pretty significant limits. So I just want to address a few different kind of caveats. So I think, in some ways we kind of met the limits of our network and our accessibility, and basically have been able to reach most of the people that we probably will be able to, unless some other opportunities open up. And that's largely due to huge security concerns. So a lot of people are very hesitant to speak openly or even to meet online. Obviously, doing online research has its own constraints, as many of you are surely familiar with now. That includes, connecting with people, developing rapport, but it also includes internet connectivity in the Myanmar context, where many calls, got disrupted partway through, or many people were not actually able to get a good enough connection to speak with us. I'd also just like to say that this is pretty ongoing work. It's relatively recent, so the results are somewhat initial and preliminary, and actually I'd be really interested to hear feedback on how to move this forward. And haven't really kind of started to put a theoretical framework around this yet. That's something I'll kind of start thinking about as I move forward. And actually, this is the first time that I've done a research project that's oriented towards the future. So this has all been very new. Trying to speak with people about the future can be difficult for sometimes to kind of imagine what the future will look like, and how to think about that conceptually. And then lastly, I just wanted to say that I'm doing this project from a position of privilege, not only as a white man from the global north, but also someone who doesn't have deep personal ties to Myanmar. And so in comparison to my collaborators, I'm able to use my name openly. I don't have to hide my identity. And that gives me quite a lot of privilege in coming towards this project, something that I think is important to recognize. So, so many of you probably are already familiar with land politics in Myanmar, but many others might not be. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about land politics before the coup, for those who are not knowledgeable of this period. So, I mean, I'll mostly be talking about the liberal transition period, but it's important to also recognize how a lot of problems related to land have a kind of a colonial legacy to them. In particular, British colonial laws related to wastelands and land acquisition continue to be really important in shaping how the problems of land in Myanmar today. So the idea of wastelands was introduced by the British as kind of lands that are unproductive and that are either not titled as agricultural land or are not categorized as forest land and put into the forest reserves. And so those are seen as lands that need to be kind of developed and can be given out to those who can use it more economically productively. And that's shaped a lot of land grabbing in the post-colonial era. There are also laws instituted that allowed for the state to acquire land, which continue to influence policy. Obviously, the role of the military has been hugely important since the coup. The military is in the 1962 coup. The military is engaged in land grabbing historically, whether it's for army camps or just to kind of hold on to land. And that became even more pronounced since the late 1980s, as Myanmar became kind of more economically liberalized, which created a lot of incentives for land grabbing by companies that are associated with the military as well, which are typically called crony companies. And then particularly important is the 2008 Constitution, which, as it's well known, that it ensured continued military control within the government, but it also put land under the ownership of the state, which takes ownership away from the people and really makes the state kind of essential control of land. So the liberal, or sometimes called democratic, transition period is also really important. The 10 years of transition away from a direct military junta to a civilian government run in the first period by the USDP party led by U Thein Sein, and then later by Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy. So this was a very busy period for land reform. There were a lot of different changes. There were both kind of reactionary forms of laws passed, but also at the same time, a lot of openness and struggles over land, and a big role for civil society. So for the former, an example are the vacant fallow and virgin land laws and the farmland law. The VFV law is a direct kind of inheritance of this idea of wastelands. So vacant fallow and virgin lands are seen as kind of wastelands that investors can apply for permits to acquire, even if local people have been using them customarily for decades. And the farmland allowed for that land to be registered as titled land, as with other lands throughout the country. And so the two of these laws combined legitimized processes of land grabbing and also exacerbated them. This was also a period of increasing signing of ceasefires between the military and ethnic armed organizations, EAOs, which has led to what Kevin Woods has called ceasefire capitalism, where when these agreements were signed, it allowed for new flows of investment into ethnic areas that were previously kind of closed off. Lots of new forms of resource extraction and also land grabbing. But at the same time, there's a lot of demonstrations against this across the country, and civil society flourished and became very active. And when the government tried to develop a national land use policy in 2012, without much civil society input, a little bit of kind of superficial consultation, civil society pushed back really hard, and that actually led to a very in-depth countrywide consultative process that made the NLUP much more democratic and much more concerned with a range of different important land issues like customary land, gender issues of land ownership and access, etc. But then a little bit later, there was a kind of a turn back with amendments to the VFE and farmland laws that put more restrictions on people's access to and use of land. So it was a kind of a rocky period, a lot of back and forth. And so one thing we did is we just kind of asked people to reflect on this period to see, what they're thinking about these changes now that they're looking back on them. And one of the interesting things is that it was huge criticism of the system as a whole, and I think people kind of looking at it with clear eyes since the coup, and seeing that despite kind of hope and optimism before of things getting better, there's a recognition that there were some serious problems that prevented progress on land reform. And so this was stated by a bunch of different kind of people. I like both of these quotes, one from a NUG official, that all these laws remain controversial for us because it's mostly central control. The land remained under state ownership and possession. We were never able to practice local land rights. And someone from an ethnic CSO saying to us that you do not own the land you've been using your whole life. And they oftentimes attributed this back to the 2008 Constitution and ownership of land by the state. And so there was a kind of increasing reflection that this was a hugely problematic system that maybe could not be reformed within that previous kind of institutional setup. And then it was also interesting to hear people reflect on land policies from EAOs or EROs. The most well-known is the Karen National Union, KNU's land policy, where, I think there was a lot of appreciation of them before, but there was also some people were critical of them or ambivalent about them. So they weren't universally appreciated. And one thing that we got through a lot of our interviews is that almost everyone really appreciates those land policies now because they're seen as being kind of the way forward, that they're much more progressive, and particularly because they're centered around people's land rights rather than the land rights of the state or political powerful institutions. So for example, one interviewee said that the KNU policy is far better than central government because the KNU land policy recognizes Indigenous people and gives them full ownership, and also tries to protect them from exploitation. But of course, the human resources and administrative financial capacities are weak, so they were never able to do as they planned. There was also some recognition that there were limits in the ability to kind of implement those policies. So I want to just give you a very quick demonstration of kind of an example of those problematic policies that everyone is talking about and how they play out in practice. And this is based off of research that I did in person before, we really thought that in-person research was something so incredible. So this was done in 2019 and 2020. And it was on oil palm plantations in Tanantai region and in the far south. So just a little bit of background about this issue. In 1999, the military junta wanted to really create this new economic sector of producing palm oil and to turn Tanantai into the so-called edible oil bowl of Myanmar, which was partly framed around kind of self-sufficiency in production of resources. But it was also part of an effort to gain control over areas that had been partly controlled by rebel groups, including the KNU and other groups that had kind of been fighting against the government since the late 80s. So this process of kind of expanding plantations and building new roads into the far south is a part of kind of state territorialization and control over these spaces, and oil palm plantations were part of that kind of mechanism. So there were huge amounts of concessions granted. Ultimately, it was found that 500,000 hectares were permitted as of 2020, although actually only almost just under a third of those were actually developed. And so a lot of land was logged and not planted with oil palm. And as part of this kind of territorialization effort, villagers were moved to make way for these plantations, but also as part of counterinsurgency efforts. So it was that territorialization, military control, and palm plantation development all were wrapped in one. And part of the justification was that their land was wasteland. And that was later legitimized with the 2012 land laws. So there's huge amounts of displacement and dispossession, creating lots of different livelihood problems for local people, which is a perfect example of the problems of the land policies of the past. But also representative of this liberal democratic transition period is that there was a lot of conflict and contestation over this process. So communities, oftentimes working with civil society groups, were engaged in a range of different kinds of struggles, oftentimes with a legal edge to it, over the boundaries of plantations. You know, if they could show that plantations had expanded beyond the concession permit area, then they could claim that part of it was illegal and they could try to get some of that land back. In other cases, like in this village here, people moved back to their old village, which had become turned into an oil palm plantation, and they tried to occupy these spaces and eventually apply for permission to stay there. So it was a contentious period for sure. But since the coup, a lot has changed. Of course, CSOs have been kind of in danger for various reasons, and so have oftentimes gone into hiding or exile. Communities are afraid to kind of monitor the developments that are happening in the field and to speak up, because if you can be framed as being against the military, then there's a lot of dangerous consequences, of course. So as I move towards talking about perspectives on the future, I think it's worth just providing a little bit of background of what's happened since the coup, because can be a very confusing period, even for people who are trying to pay attention to what's going on. It's hard to keep up with all the changes that have happened so quickly in less than 2 years. So one thing, of course, is that there's been a movement from the initial anti-coup protests towards a kind of a longer term struggle, war, conflict, and revolution, which could call from moving from a protest movement to a people's war. In terms of institutional changes, there lawmakers who were elected in the 2020 election and then went into exile formed the National Unity Consultative Council, which is kind of an interface between them as lawmakers and EROs, ethnic resistance organizations, civil society, and many different groups. And through that, the National Unity Government as a government in exile was formed, and a kind of interim government. There was also the creation of People's Defense Forces across the country, which are militias that are seeking to kind of protect people's land and lives and communities, but also to expand control that they have and reduce the control that the military junta, also known as the State Administration Council, SAC, has. And so actually it's shown that that's been successful, I mean, at a huge human cost, of course, and that the degree of territory that SAC has control over has continued to decrease over time, and what EROs, NUG, and PDFs have control over has continued to expand. And I think, one of the big changes also is that, of course, everyone is focused on everyday crises and problems that everyone is struggling with, but there's increasingly an emphasis on trying to kind of build up the capacity to govern those areas that are under territorial control of different non-military groups, and to start thinking about the future in that way, about what kind of future society people want and what can be done to try to model that right now on the ground, and to move towards that future. I think also just it's worth noting that this is all also happening at a time when resource exploitation and environmental destruction is incredibly rampant, because of the lack of checks and balances on the military and military companies. Of course, also resistance groups are engaged in forms of resource exploitation to fund their activities. So obviously, land and environmental issues are not just things that were of concern before, and now the focus is completely on conflict and revolution. They're actually becoming increasingly urgent and important to take into consideration. So we Yeah, so we spoke with a range of different kind of resistance actors, and I should have mentioned before that we generally only spoke with people who are resisting the junta in some way or another. So we obviously didn't speak with anyone from the junta, but we also weren't speaking with groups that are associated with them in any way, because we wanted to get the perspectives of resistance organizations and actors. One of the things that we really wanted to learn from them is whether they wanted to see kind of in the future, if you're trying to address all those land problems that I just mentioned, if you want to do that, is it best to work with the reforms that were being pursued in the past, or does it need to be completely transformed? So we kind of frame this as revolution versus evolution. And there was definitely a desire amongst most for revolution. I mean, so many people recognize that there were some positive changes that happened in land policy, such as in the national land use policy, the recognition of customary land and equal gendered access to land. But still, a consensus was that those positive elements have to be kind of taken up within a completely transformed legal and institutional framework. So just a few quotes that kind of exemplify that. One ethnic CSO said to us that, "I don't want these old institutions and laws at all, they just create problems." And another said to us that institutions have to be replaced because the old system is corrupt and not transparent. It's very centralized, it has to be replaced by new institutions and structures. And I thought this quote from a Myanmar NGO based in Yangon was quite instructive and very poetic, really, that when the coup happened, everything became blank. In the past, we had to work on what was already sketched, but now is a time that it's blank. We can draw our beautiful picture of what we want. We don't want to be messy again, referencing them, and complex thinking again. So I mean, not everyone sees things exactly the same way, of course, but we felt that there was a general consensus that this is a kind of, despite all the problems, despite the terrible situation, this is actually an opportunity to kind of start again and to think through a new future of land relations and land access and ownership. So these perspectives were, in terms of the visions and principles that people had, were very much in line with the view and political desire for a society that is federal and democratic. And obviously there's a range of different perspectives on that, and those came through in our interviews as well. When some people say federal, they mean a completely decentralized system where the federal government has a small role to play, while others see a more kind of balance of power between federal government and local governments. So there are kind of a certain degree of disagreements, but there's a consensus that land governance should be something that is driven by these principles. So, for example, someone from the NUG said to us that the federal government is very much far from the local communities. So the best way is that the federal unit government, which means the federal unit government meaning the local government like state or region, must manage the land because they are closer to the local communities. And for a lot of people, this meant that land systems really have to be community-centered and have to be quite decentralized. So someone from a state-level consultative council, which are these kind of new councils that interface between civil society groups, PDFs, NUG, said that we are going to the way of government that is people-centered or people-oriented. We will make people the main stakeholders, so we will change from centralization to decentralization, from top-down to bottom-up system. And I think a lot of these ideas and principles are kind of quite consistent with some that have been outlined by different groups more publicly. So one that I just wanted to flag is by Land in Our Hands, or LIOH. which is a network organization of civil society groups working on land that was very active before the coup and continues to be so. And I thought, you know, they've put out these 6 demands or 6 principles that shape their demands for land, peace, and democracy, which I think actually fit what a lot of the respondents that we were talking with were saying. So principle 1, that land, water, and forest are for those who live on it and work it. Principle 2, to stop and reverse land grabbing system-wide. 3, define an across-the-board land size ceiling suited to agroecological context with land redistribution and land restitution system-wide. Respect for plural tenure systems and customary practices within a federalized system. Apply genuine environmental protection and respect for basic civil and political rights and freedoms of all working people, ethnic peoples, and rural women. So as part of this, you know, in relationship to those ideas, a really common sentiment is that land governance in the future should really be built from the bottom up based upon customary land tenure. And a lot of customary land tenure is within lands that were previously classified as wastelands, including areas like this. This is Swidden cultivation in an upland area in Karen state, which previously would be the kinds of lands that were targeted by those policies. And so they really want to flip that around, where customary land becomes the basis of land rights. Instead of it being centered within the state, it's centered within communities and their long-standing practices of using and managing land. So for example, as a Myanmar leader of an NGO said to us, we'll still need recognition of customary tenure, which supports the sustainable development approach. We need Indigenous people and customary tenure in land reform, otherwise we can't keep peace. And this is also really an important part of a federalist vision, in that there's these diverse forms of customary land tenure systems. No customary land system, none of them are equally the same. They're all have their own kind of uniqueness. And so that means each area has to kind of have its own set of policies and laws governing that land that is suitable for those types of land practices. Another really kind of important principle is to make sure that in the future that there's kinds of regulations and protections against land grabbing, which was seen as just being such a huge problem in the pre-coup area, and continues to be so to this day, of course. So, for example, someone working for an international organization said to us that each state and region, especially if they are in control, should have their own laws and policies that are in line with preferably international standards, free, prior, and informed consent process, FPIC, bottom-up law formulations, getting feedback and comments from experts, and international practices. Another really interesting kind of point that many people made, both Bamar and ethnic interviewees, was that just like people had a kind of a newfound respect for ethnic land policies like the KNU land policy, there was a recognition that that kind of decentralized federal development of policies and ideas by ethnic groups is actually really important now in moving towards a kind of a federal system. And actually kind of land rights in a federal system are much clearer in ethnic areas than in Bamar majority areas, which were, you know, largely operating under the state system. So there was a kind of a common sentiment that in the future, in a federal system, what would happen in Bamar majority areas in terms of land governance isn't as clear as what would happen in ethnic areas. As someone working for a multi-ethnic CSO said to us, that in ethnic states there have been a lot of activities to develop federal land policies and implement them. However, in Bamar majority areas or regions, the political transition is a big change. Unlike the ethnic states, they had never thought about federal system or governance in those areas. So just to kind of, the last section of the talk for today is thinking about action, not just kind of big ideas and visions, but what people think can be done today to address these kinds of issues. So there is some disagreement actually amongst some people as to whether land issues is something that people should be working on at this moment. There were a few people, I think, especially with non-Myanmar people working with INGOs, not all of them, but some of them, that felt like the current conflict and revolution is the most critical. So someone working for an NGO said, I'm not sure it is an appropriate time to talk about land governance. They need to win the revolution first. But others, and I think most of the people we talked to actually felt that it still is important, even though it might not be the most urgent issue that people are facing on a day-to-day basis, but it's important because of its connections. So someone from a state level consultative council saying that every sector is important, but land is related to everything and important for everything. So we must talk about land reform now. If we don't start this discussion on land reform now, the transitional period will take too much time, be unsystematic, and not well organized because we don't know what point from which to start. There are kind of policy discussions going on natural resource management and also land management that are happening within NUCC and NUG. But there are limits in terms of who can access those discussions, partly because there's a lot of kind of sensitivity about who is involved in the meetings. But also there are not all ethnic groups see this kind of forum as being completely open and accessible. But many kind of express that it's important to work on dialogue and encourage debate on moving forward on land issues. Although there's caveats on that, such as, for example, people within Myanmar feel like it's harder to have those discussions because of their higher security concerns. One kind of common sentiment also is that there's work that actually can be done on the ground right now to address land issues that are pressing in many different areas. For example, someone from an INGO is saying that one good thing for us at the moment is that people have to handle their own regions because of the crisis. At the moment, with the country chaotic, some have to start practicing decentralized government because it is needed. So it's a kind of forced decentralization. People that we talked to working with the NUG recommended kind of giving guidance to communities on how to do bottom-up land use planning and natural resource governance in areas that are controlled by PDFs or by EROs, saying that NUG has already declared some liberated areas. They have local administrative bodies already formed. People can manage in that area. In that case, what NUG should do is give guidance for the bottom-up land use planning, because every village must do their bottom-up land use plans village by village. Others really emphasize the importance of documenting abuses, land grabbing, documenting people's customary land rights. We need to see, watch, and document. That is something we should do. So if we are doing that, we won't be able to deal with the problems, but something is better than nothing. And so that's important to kind of have eyes on the ground and to be watching out when in a period when the media is restricted and CSOs are highly restricted. So I'll wrap up here. I know there's a lot to discuss here, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about it in the Q&A. But just kind of to reemphasize some of the key points, that land continues to be absolutely important, and even during a period of conflict, because it's connected to so many different issues. And also, as many said, that this is a really important moment to start envisioning kind of a different future for land in the country that moves away from the problems of the past. And many feel like if you don't start doing it now, then it could never happen. And many felt that it's important to have dialogue and policy discussions alongside efforts to improve what's happening on the ground, particularly to protect against land grabbing of customary land. And so I'll just leave you with this image. This comes from my earlier fieldwork, and this was before the coup, of villagers who are burning oil palm trees to make space for institutions within their communities. As an example of people kind of changing land relations to try to make a better future for their connection and relationship to land. All right, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Miles, for this really informative and illuminating talk, and what an ending image to leave us with. Again, in the chat earlier, I posted 2 internet resources, including one to learn more about the coup's impact, and a link to where you can directly donate to those participating in the civil disobedience movement. So we have some time here for a Q&A with Miles. If you'd like to ask a question directly to Miles, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, or you can type it directly into the chat, and we already have one question to start us off from A. Miles, would you like me to read it to you directly? Would that be easiest?
Sure, yeah.
Great. So A asks, you said that there is broad agreement that there needs to be land revolution and that many want to look at customary land use systems as the basis for a post-coup world. Given that a lot of the pre-coup conflict was driven by land and resources, how are the people you are speaking to envisioning achieving these goals, especially since many of the smaller ethnic armed organizations, many of which are sitting out of the current conflict, formed out of resentments against the majority group in their areas and not against the central government?
Yeah, that's I think I would just mention again that our research was done with and the connections to the groups that we were able to connect with are larger organizations, other armed groups, and that are very much involved in the conflict and fighting against the government. So I think, in some ways that's a limitation of our work, but it also is a kind of a reflection of the broader perspective that we take in it. But it would certainly be interesting and useful to kind of get their perspectives. With that said, I think, just to say in general, I'm not sure how well this answers the question, but that there is a huge amount of diversity and heterogeneity in these perspectives. What I've kind of summarized are some of the common forms of consensus amongst groups that are largely kind of that are fighting against the military. But even within those groups, there's lots of disagreements. And there's even, as it's pretty well documented, there's resentment against the NUG and even NUCC for being still too kind of dominated by Bamar people and by the NLD, not taking into account the concerns of ethnic groups. And so some ethnic groups have kind of distanced themselves as a result. So yeah, I would just kind of say that it's an issue that I think is worth kind of taking into account to address those diverse perspectives as much as possible. Thanks for the question.
Great, and we have another question from Roderick.
Yeah, hi, can you hear? Yeah. Hi, Dr. Miles, good to virtually meet you again. Thanks for the great presentation. I just had a question with regard to sort of, mostly in terms of like how as you already mentioned, there is a sort of divergence in this ethnic communities, and every ethnic group, as I understand, has their own sort of aspiration and sort of their own movement. And that comes along with insurgency movement. So even in terms of how they sort of conceptualize the future, I was wondering, how do they sort of talk about this, this land issue nested in this insurgency movement or this ethnic movements in relation to one another, as well as in relation to the bigger nation state of Burma, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think just some of I can offer some reflections of some of the discussions that we had with people who are working for ethnic CSOs and also EROs, which is, I think, a little bit different from some of the kind of Bamar interviewees who are a bit more focused on kind of transformation of land systems for the whole country. While with the ethnic interviewees, there's much more concern with ensuring control over land governance within their territories. And that is the kind of primary and most important objective. And so I think the big concern is that in this moment is that it seems like there's an opening for more ethnic groups to be involved in the resistance movement, but there's a worry that it will still kind of be dominated by Bamar interests, and their concerns and their interests will become somewhat secondary. So it's a bit general, but I think the main concern is about kind of putting control over our territory and the rights to make their own decisions about how land is managed completely as being the most important kind of objective and interest. So yeah, and it's great to meet you online again too, Rob. Glad to see you're doing well.
Thank you.
We have a question from Jenny.
Hey, Miles, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. That was such a great talk. I appreciate your point that it's been really hard to follow what's happening in Myanmar in politics and anything environment. It's yeah, that's been true. And I also really like your emphasis on envisioning the future. I think that's just such an important thing to be doing that I imagine was also really hard to introduce, right, in this kind of like moment of conflict and turmoil. So I was thinking about that, and I was kind of extrapolating out like beyond governance and sort of like self-determination to land, right? Like in this kind of future ideal, if the ethnic groups were able to, I guess, reclaim land, let's say, right? Like take it back or be able to self-govern, do they have ideas about what they would do with it? Like in a kind of land use sense? Like, what are we talking about? Like, are we going back to like, like a late 90s land use situation, or is this like pre-oil palm plantations, or do they want to sort of take over what the military is doing and like, just have control and profit from those natural resources, but in the same kind of, means of production? Like what kind of systems are they actually envisioning, right? Because it's such a messy landscape, right? And it's almost akin to taking over the control of the state at all levels, right? And it's like, once you seize power, what do you do, right? Like, what does it look like kind of administratively, So I guess beyond the administration, like what is the kind of practicality of the vision of the land use look like for them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, one thing I learned from doing research about the future is that it's really hard to talk about. It's hard to ask questions about, not only in this moment, I think just more generally. And it's hard for people to answer as well. And a lot of people were kind of like, well, yeah, I haven't really thought about that, or like, I can't give you a specific answer, but I can tell you this. And I would say the same if someone was asking me about the future of any kind of issues that I'm familiar with. So I think, we might have been a little bit naive coming into this, thinking that people could outline or would want to outline kind of this specificities of the future. But I think people were much more comfortable speaking in generalities. And when it comes to kind of how to use land in areas that people gain control over, that was something that people didn't want to kind of provide very specific plans or visions for that. I think they're more interested in outlining how the problems of the past would be addressed through some of the kind of visions and strategies and principles that I outlined here today. So, and for many, it would prevent some of the kind of problematic land uses if you are having restrictions on land acquisition, or you have restrictions on land, the size of land that can be owned, etc. But obviously in practice, like things will likely be very different. And in areas controlled by EROs, there is lots of resource extraction going on and big land investments as well. So it's not like just like a different group of people controlling land necessarily leads to a better arrangement. But I think, you know, still their visions of how to manage and use land are quite different. When you base land management systems off of kind of customary land, as that leads to a very different approach. For example, the way that conservation is approached by Karen groups, by Karen Civil Society and KNU, for example, in the Salween Peace Park, which is about a mixed use approach of conservation and land use and cultural uses, etc. So I think these different visions and principles would play out very differently, even if people don't have those specific plans. So thanks for the question, and great to see you online too, Jenny. Thanks for coming.
So we have 2 more questions in the chat. The first is from Eric. Is there any evidence that arguments by civil society groups and local communities that land governance needs to be radically rethought and redesigned are being considered or even debated among anti-military political elites and institutions?
Yeah, I think there is. So we definitely found that in people that we spoke with who are connected to the NUG, who would be those kind of anti-military political elites and institutions, or one example of them, were taking into account a much more kind of revolutionary approach to changes in the ways that land should be managed, being more federalist, decentralized, democratic, and more than, you know, some of them may have considered in the past, in the pre-coup era. And this is, you know, reflected in various documents, and is also reflected in the broader political position of those groups to completely, you know, do away with the 2008 constitution, for example, which was a big demand of ethnic groups when they were involved in NUCC. So still lots of kind of tensions and disagreements, especially between EROs and NUCC and NUG. But I think, you know, closer in kind of the views of what should happen than in the past, and these ideas are kind of filtering through for sure. Thanks for the question.
And the second question we have in the chat is from Billy. How do ethnic communities envision their right to development and future or other discourses of modernity that the Burmese state, both the military junta and the short-lived quasi-civilian government, disguises extractivism under?
Sorry, just looking at the question again. Yeah, so I mean, I guess the question is about how do ethnic communities kind of interact with ideas of development and modernity. That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a full answer to that. I mean, our research wasn't explicitly looking at kind of discourses and perceptions of development of ethnic communities. I think, you know, in a lot of cases, it is about having the freedom to make those decisions on their own, rather than being dictated to them by the central government and by the military. So that, you know, it can lead to similar forms of kind of extractivism that are worked around in development. But I think, you know, one of the big differences is that a lot of EROs are closely connected to civil society, and especially the EROs that are associated with or more closer to the NUG and UCC. And actually, others have been writing about how that's part of the reason why they're more closely connected to NUG and NUCC, because that was a demand from civil society groups to be involved in resistance against the junta. And they listen to those civil society groups. So I guess, and those civil society groups tend to have kind of more radical perspectives about, or critical perspectives on development, and want to see different forms of alternative development that are not so extractive. And so therefore, I think that that has an effect on kind of having a different vision of development that is not so extractive as the military. That doesn't mean that land grabbing can't occur, or that there might not be extractive resource projects, and those do happen by ERO actors. But it's moderated and shaped by the concerns of civil society, who are also kind of interacting and shaped by concerns of local communities. So that puts some checks and balances on that are not there for the military, for sure. That's a great question, though.
Great. I think that was all of our questions. I'm going to check one more time to make sure no other hands are raised. It looks like that was all. Again, I'm going to post one more time in the chat those links to those resources, and I really encourage everyone to go check them out. And thank you so much, Miles, for this really informative and important talk and this work, and also ending our fall semester's speaker series. It was a pleasure to have you, and really thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate all the comments and questions. And again, I just wanted to mention again, this research is ongoing. So, if anyone wants to kind of be involved or like provide tips or connections to help us contact a wider group of people, we'd be glad to receive them. So thank you so much, and thanks for staying up for this talk.